all these various tools to use. Different from that.
I'm not too sure what even does actually. I want some good feedback, obviously, but like, if you don't issue a name form, you don't never show up.
We'd be unconstrained. If you want to, so you take pictures, you could not a lot, but okay, so if you want to prevent any swarm type,
Please move to the side. Either side of the table.
part of the rules here is saying that the
Oh, this way, yeah? Okay, it's time for us to begin. Once again, please move to the table or to the side so that most of the people at the table can see you. Otherwise, you're not participating in the experiment about this setup. As you've probably heard a lot this week, note well. I'm sure you've read it already this week. This is the agenda that was posted a couple weeks ago on the mail list. And this is the last opportunity to bash it before we begin. Any agenda bashes? Okay. For a minute taker, Sean Leonard has agreed to do that. For a Jabber scribe, I think Rich has agreed to do that. Delegated to Carl Mander, okay. So, and the blue sheets have been started. The first briefing that we're going to have is the status on the EAI addresses. And I believe Wei is going to do that, right? Okay, I will put your slides up and then you can talk from where you are.
Okay, hopefully, yeah, the mic sounds like it's live. So I'm going to be presenting international email addresses for 5 certs. Hopefully you can hear me okay. My name is Wei Chuang. This is work also done with Alexei and Melnikov. So just to recap what this draft is about, it's to allow for UTF-8 UTF-8 local parts and email addresses to be represented as a subject and issuer in X599 certs. This also has some additional modernizations of internationalized email addresses. This will be formatted as an other names field, so it's an extension from the other names field, and that's to provide backwards compatibility with existing verifiers that may potentially not understand that form. Next slide. So the status since last IETF, there's been 06 through 08 drafts. There's been a lot of discussion about name constraints, and the rest of the slides basically are about that and to see if what's been proposed is reflects what the working group is okay with. But also there's been a lot of work on other clarifications for internationalization. One important thing is that domains for both the new SMTP UTF-8 name type as well as RC822 name must conform to internationalized domain names for applications 2008. So that'd be a new requirement on the legacy name form as well. There's also been clarification that the email address form that's going to be in that type is going to conform to RFC 5321, the mail envelope form of email addresses as opposed to the header form. And there's also been additional clarification as to how to best prohibit A-labeled addresses and things that look a lot like it. So in particular, prohibiting domain labels that start with 2 characters plus followed by 2 dashes. That will prohibit all the potential also lookalike forms as well as A-label forms. And also clarification on case folding for the email addresses, essentially to only have case folding for ASCII domain labels, but otherwise for the local part as well as for the U labels, no case folding will be allowed, and this is in particular done for the comparisons. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we're going to dive deep into name constraints, and it's somewhat complicated. So I've tried to build out a couple slides here that tries to describe some of the potential things that have come up and the current solution for that, and see if everyone's okay with them. So okay, so diving in. So the name constraint forms for SMTP UTF-8 name is going to be disjoint from RFC 822 name, so that the name constraints, for example, for here in example.com, essentially means that if you want to allow for subjects of both forms, you're going to have a name constraints for both forms as well. That is meant to prevent confusion, as we'll see in the next set of slides. Next slide. Okay, so there's a lot of consideration for how does this interoperate with legacy systems. So you can, there's like a scenario would be that if you have a legacy CA in your certificate chain, how would that interact with a SMTP UTF-8 name aware path verifier? And would the SMTP UTF-8 aware path verifier misinterpret the intent of that intermediate CA? So here in this example, we have a name constraint on RFC 822 name, example.com. It may be the intent of that CA that they want to constrain all example.coms for both forms, but there's no way to express that, with that legacy CA. And then, so potentially the SMTP UTF-8 name aware path verifier may misinterpret the fact that there is no SMTP UTF-8 name constraint as actually being unconstrained for SMTP UTF-8 name subjects, and that would be a problem. Next slide. Here's, sorry about the formatting problem here.
Let me fix that.
Okay, so I can just talk through it. So the solution here is that having both name types actually provides a means of communicating that the CA actually is aware of SMTP UTF-8 name types. And it provides, part of the reason for requiring both of them is to indicate to a path verifier that, hey, look, it's we kind of understand what we're doing with SMTP UTF-8 named constraints. So basically, the rule would be that if a path verifier sees that there's only RFC 822 name, then it would, and it sees that there are subjects with SMTP UTF-8 name, it would fail verification because it saw that name constraint didn't fully consider SMTP UTF-8 name. This also then allows for legacy certificate profiles to work.
So you would fail verification or would just refuse to accept the other name form?
You'd fail verification.
Okay.
Next slide. Okay. And let me just describe what's going on there. So as a consequence of that, if this particular representation could allow for, and it's for things to be represented in only one name form and not the other. So that was going to be an example of, say you wanted to only represent, next slide, I think. Say you only wanted to represent an SMTP UTF-8 name email address, say because it has, you only want UTF-8 name local parts. Okay, so I think next slide.
That's the last slide.
Okay, go back about one. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Right, okay, so the notion there was you can specify a name constraint on the SMTP UTF-8 and a subject, but you can also, since you have to specify RFC 822 name, you can specify basically something that says there shouldn't be something there, which is, you can use an invalid TLD to represent the fact that you don't want that, because you have to have this indicator that you have to have both SMTP UTF-8 name constraints as well as RFC 822 name to tell the path verifier that it understands SMTP UTF-8 name. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so sort of the mirror for this legacy compatibility is basically what happens if you have a legacy path verifier that's looking at intermediate CA that is SMTP UTF-8 aware, and how would that react to a name constraint that in some sense it doesn't understand. So that path verifier could, for example, run into a profile that tries to exclude SMTP UTF-8 name, and how would that react? And I think if this slide's missing one or two little parts, I guess in the PowerPoint translation. But anyways, I'll just verbally describe it as well. So the potential issues, and that would also allow a bypass, right? That that legacy verifier might allow that profile to pass verification. But my interpretation, and just discussing with Jim
There's only 8 slides.
What's that?
There are only 8 slides in the PDF as well.
Okay. No, there's just one component. There's just like some additional things that just says, exclude this. It's okay. So
we had a question from Jabber, from Stefan. Are there name constraints really used still in any significant way?
There's very little name constraints in use today. There's been academic papers that very minuscule amount they are used, but I think name constraints are important, and it's important to think about, especially as email addresses potentially may get put into certificates more and more. I think there's going to be an interest in having these types of name constraints. An area, for example, would be like the basically, there's advantages to using name constraints through the CAD form process, as an example. Hopefully, cover that. Okay, so going back to the slide here, so my understanding of 5280 and interpretation of how extensions that are marked critical, such as name constraints and subject alt names, is that if a legacy path verifier sees something it doesn't understand, that it would fail verification. That was my interpretation. But then there could be disagreement, just talking to Jim here. So, I mean, that was something, so this, if it doesn't, then this would be potentially unconstrained. That could be a problem. And then, so that's, you know, I wanted to make sure that, you know, there's agreement that it would be appropriately protected from.
Okay, John has a question, and then Victor has a question remotely.
John Clenson. I'm going to pretend I know absolutely nothing about X509 certificates for a minute, but I want to make a comment about this. As somebody who has managed too many programming projects in my life, the convolutions, the apparent convolutions of this decision tree as to what you check and how things interact and what the absence of this one means to that one. Look to me, unless your implementer community is very, very different from most implementer communities, like an opportunity, indeed an invitation for inconsistent implementations. And that's a little scary, especially for things like certificates. I think of ways to fix it, but they have other problems, as you've undoubtedly figured out. But this is a little scary. And the internationalization stuff doesn't make it more scary because of the internationalization stuff. It makes it more scary because it multiplicatively introduces more cases. So just a comment, don't know what to do about it, but this feels more complex than is consistent with the expectation of high quality, consistent, interoperable implementations.
Okay, Victor, you're up.
Hi. I want to follow up to what John Clenson said. It was actually a good introduction. The reason I got interested in this topic at all is that somebody contributed some code to OpenSSL to support this this new draft. And I looked at the code, and it seemed to me that there were all these bypass issues, which I then, joined the discussion about the working group last call and so on. So I agree that implementation is in fact a critical thing here. I'm not sure how many application developers will be involved in implementing this stack. I would hope that by and large it would be implemented in a small number of TLS toolkits, OpenSSL, GNU TLS, S-channel, and the like. And then that would be made available to all applications that the developers of this small number of toolkits would hopefully get it right. But indeed, it is tricky. So I do not deny the complexity.
So Victor, I would think they would be in email packages.
I don't think so. I think the verifying that the certificate content and constraints match up is the job of the X509 stack. And the email software can just see whether the certificate's valid or not.
No, I'm trying to give an example. The Microsoft case, S-channel has nothing to do with that. It's in
right.
CAPI.
Yeah, I know X509 is separate. S-channel just does the messaging. Yeah, I understand. Right. So it's in CAPI. But I still would hope that that component would be somewhat centrally maintained and wouldn't be in every single program that deals with email certificates. But, but it's certainly an issue. I'm not denying it. What I really wanted to ask today was that I saw that the latest iteration or proposal on the list from the document editor was to make the SMTP UTF-8 name extension critical. And I'm generally loath to see new critical extensions, especially in intermediate certificates. It's one thing to mark or things critical in leaf certificates, but especially in intermediates, this would essentially make them useless for many purposes to verifiers that don't understand critical extensions. They're very rarely successfully used in X509. My original proposal to resolve this difficulty was for the CA to craft, functionally equivalent RFC822 name constraints that preclude whatever it is they're trying to preclude, perhaps with a slightly different form of the name than what appears in the UTF-8 variant. And I was trying to avoid critical extensions. But, you know, if there are folks here, especially with deep experience in, you know, PKI, PKXX509, who think that the critical extension thing is just fine, I'm okay with that, I guess. I'm a little leery of it.
Aren't I mean, my understanding is name constraints and subject alt name extensions are marked critical already.
I haven't seen any. I haven't seen any subject alt names that are marked critical ever. And as for name constraints, I also think they generally aren't marked critical, but I'm not sure. That one I could be wrong about.
Okay. Sean, I think you're next.
Hi, Sean Leonard. So in thinking about this, I was wondering if we can look at it a little different way. Specifically, is there a way to look at this at more simplistically and concisely as pairwise? What I mean is that an SMTP UTF-8 name aware application needs to ensure that name constraints that are found in the chain need to be enforced upon SMTP UTF-8 name. Conversely, applications that are not using SMTP UTF-8 name don't really care whether it's there or not, therefore they don't really care if the name constraints are not. It confounds the problem of separating the certificate validation stack from the application part, but it gets the same security result, if that makes sense. The other thing that could be done is that the SMTP UTF-8 name aware application could also ensure, which means that this document could require that any SMTP UTF-8 name constraint that's found in the name constraints chain is also reflected in the RFC 822 name case as well. Otherwise, that's a separate validation or consistency error.
Richard Barnes, I was going to suggest a similar thing, I think probably just phrased slightly differently, which is that it seems like you should be able to map, you could require that RFC 822 names that are in there match against any SMTP UTF-8 names that are present, rather than requiring that the constraints be consistent. You could take the intersection of the two constraints.
So something like that existed in an earlier draft, and that's what Victor first ranted about. So not surprising, he's back in the queue.
Right. I think we need to look at very specific use cases, right? There are two badly behaving corner cases, right? A legacy verifier against a SMTP UTF-8 aware CA, and vice versa. And it's really the SMTP UTF-8 verifier and a CA that's completely agnostic of or ignorant or whatever of SMTP UTF-8 that's the worst case. So Richard, what are you suggesting if I have a CA that constrained, you know, the entire universe it knew about, RFC UTF-8, sorry, RFC 822 name, it said, thou shalt only have example.com. And then somebody comes along and issues a certificate that's has a UTF-8 local part for some other domain. How would the verifier know to reject this under your proposal?
So that was an off-the-cuff proposal. I'm not sure I know the answer to your question, but I think that I see where you're going. I think you're right.
I mean, there was, I think at one point under discussion, the question as to whether RFC 828 name constraints should be applied somehow to SMTP UTF-8 names that you find and, you know, and have to match them. But I think that's too restrictive in other ways. One can't always create sensible constraints in the RFC 822 namespace that match the SMTP UTF-8 names without doing all kinds of complicated conversions that get us into trouble as well. So the proposal on the table is to keep the namespaces largely separate, but ensure that there aren't opportunities for bypass. So checks are still done on each namespace separately, but if one or the other side is missing, then the verifier, ensures that the right things are happening and perhaps rejects the certificate because it's missing the expected other side of the constraints.
So it's pretty clear to me what you're describing now is not in the document.
Well, the latest proposals that I've seen on the list is essentially actually one of the two cases that are problematic. There's, I agree, is solved exactly along the lines that were discussed. What's new today is the use of critical extensions, which is one way of handling the other case. I had proposed a different way, and they're both really satisfactory. It's just a question of which one is really more practical. I'm a little concerned about imposing a requirement to mark an intermediate certificate extension critical, because it means that the intermediate certificate now can only be used to sign things for verifiers that understand that extension. And while that may be appropriate for leaves, it's a big step for intermediate certs. It really limits them severely. So I don't know how practical that'll be.
Okay, Dan?
So from Jabber, Stefan asks, wouldn't it actually solve most relevant cases just to have RFC 822 name constraints applied to both name types?
So we discussed that at length, and there's three cases you have to consider where you're trying to deal with basically RFC 5280. In the discussion of that talks about three aspects of an email address that might be constrained: the domain part, the host part, and then the left-hand side of the @ sign. And so that does solve the first two cases, but it does not solve the case, the third one, which is because it can't carry the UTF-8 string. So one of the things we talked about or asked but never got a good answer to is, does anyone use a name constraint that has anything on the left-hand side of the email address? And so if someone is able to spend the time to do the research and show us that really what we're talking about is people only constrain the right-hand side, then we end up with a much simpler and easier solution.
That really does seem true. Is there a way to find out the answer to that question?
The only thing I know how to do is go through use Adam Langley's Go code and pass through all that stuff that's out there in the logs.
I guess another question would be, is there a way to specify just the RHS side of the constraint and somehow carve out room to do the LHS side later if anybody ever decided to actually wanted it?
So the argument, what I think you're asking, what I think you're asking, Eric, is did we put too much flexibility in 5280 and we're better off taking that one little piece of being able to constrain just the left-hand side out?
I'm not sure if that's the question I'm asking, but I'm prepared to have you rephrase it that way.
Okay.
I guess what the question I was trying to ask was, is like, if a lot of the complexity in this document comes from trying to restrict both sides, it might be in the future someone will wish to restrict both sides, but if in the present everybody only restricts the right side, can you deal with the right side and deal with the left side later if needed?
I would argue there's too much complexity in 5280.
Shocking, Sean, that you would come to that conclusion.
And Stefan makes a similar point, wondering if it's worth the complexity to get all the cases covered, and agrees with Sean.
The only case I can think of where it might actually pop up is something like an AA cert, where you're basically doing a complete match.
Right. That's the case where you're trying to constrain the combination of the left of the @ sign and the right. But the right-hand side we know how to do is either U labels or A labels. Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is we don't have consensus on the best way to solve this problem. We need to go back to the list, and we need to ask Eric to return that document to the working group.
Did we not already do that? Oh, no, we didn't. We just put it
No,
on.
you did not.
I will do that right
Please,
now.
please do.
The
Thank
first
you.
time I tried these tools, so I may also publish as an RFC, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Okay, Jim, you're up next. Oh, sorry. Didn't see you, Victor, sorry.
No problem. I'm cool with being able to constrain only the domain. It doesn't reduce the need to perform translations, because if we're going to store all the name constraints for email addresses in RFC822 name, it's not allowed to carry UTF-8, even for the domain part. So we'd always have to map UTF-8 domains to a label form, which actually matches
That's
how we do certificates. So everything would have to be normalized to a labels. If we're okay with that,
Correct.
I'm cool with that.
That's what 5280 says to do already. It was the requirement to bring in the left-hand side that led us to UTF-8.
Right. So if I have never seen a certificate that would, a CA certificate that would plausibly be as specific as a particular address. So it seems okay to narrow the scope to me.
Okay, is there anyone in the room who thinks, I see you, John, I just want to ask this question, who thinks that we should not reduce the complexity by not being able to constrain the left-hand side of the @ sign? Well, this gets a lot easier then. Okay, so now, at least I think we have a way forward, and it's a significant update to the draft, but if we do have a way forward that way.
You should now have this document back if I've done things correctly.
Okay.
As I say, it's also possible that something else happened.
John?
Yeah, John Clinton again. Two more things you should be alert to. One of which is that there are a lot of very bad implementation of IDNA out there that conform to something besides the IETF current specifications. If somebody is using a library which is dependent upon one of those other models about the standards about, reversibility and mapping back and forth without information loss between the native character / U label form and the A label / Punicode form is, to put it mildly, not guaranteed. And that's a source of potential difficulties, if not attacks. The other observation.
I agree, that's the world we live in.
As long as everybody's aware of it, I don't have a problem.
Okay.
The other observation is that I heard go by in the midst of this discussion a comment about using an invalid top-level domain name as an indicator. In the current world, there is no such thing as an invalid top-level domain name. So again, just
What he means is
dragons on both sides of the path.
Invalid is reserved.
is reserved.
Right, but you can basically exclude star.
Yeah.
Okay. Jim?
Yes. So Russ and I have been trying to practice mental telepathy for the last 2 weeks and have been failing pretty well. We finally figured out what was going on this afternoon. So the last issue on the drafts that I have was the question of, I have no idea what you support for encryption capabilities, and I want to send you an encrypted message. What algorithm and what structure do I use? And the language actually says, you really should use AES GCM. And if you don't do that, you really should use AES CDC. And after that, it's up to you to figure out how to get out of your own hell. That's not my problem. Russ mailed out a request for comments from people who write this code. We did get one response from that, which said, we think GCM is the right answer, so we basically have said the issue is closed. That's the last thing on the message document. I forget whether this is the message document or the or the certificate document, but that basically says both of the documents are done and they should be ready to progress.
Okay, does anyone have any new issues on either of these documents, the S-MIME v4 message document or the S-MIME v4 cert document, or have a concern with the resolution to this last issue? Okay, we'll do the Shepherd's write-up and send it to Eric for IETF last call then.
I will find my taser and go Blaker hunting at some point.
Right. Okay, so the I can't remember which order we were going to do these in. Okay, Rich, you're up.
Sure. Next. But I want to be
State your name.
It was on the slide. Rich Saul presenting. Okay, so this is about adding an extension to OCSP responses. OCSP currently specs that there are no extensions in the response. The issue is, as we start to move more toward automated stapling by servers, we want to be able to show something to the server operator if the response they get back from the CA or its delegate says, no, your cert's no good. Examples, the check bounced, revoked by ticket, so and so and so and so. So it's intended to be human readable description, completely optional. Next page. I can't do ASN1 anymore, but Russ helped. Russ said, oh, is this what you mean? I just cut and pasted it from his email message, changed the font to look computery. Yeah, okay, Jim says it's wrong. Okay, fine, we'll fix it. I haven't written the draft yet even. So the idea is there's an OID and an extension in the response that says if you see this OID, what's there is a UTF-8 string. And the only intent of the UTF-8 string is to be displayed to the recipient of such an OCSP response. Only valid on a revoked response.
Jim, other than the colon equals, what's wrong?
That's it.
Okay.
All right. Next, implementation. OpenSSL next release would have it. I happen to be in a position to make that happen. The CA browser forum, Ryan Sleevey had posted a couple notes, and he and I went back in email. He said, no, we would profile this out of the base requirements. I don't care. I mean, eventually we'll get around to it. Right now, there's no way for responses to come back. So this would open that up. And I don't know if it's, pardon me, there's not a requirement that the CA actually sign the OCSP responses. Right, so I don't think it matters much.
Okay, so the idea here is that we're talking about things, since we're getting close, we think, of finishing the current chartered work. People wanted to discuss what might be next. Again, the requirements are that for even being chartered in this group is that there's definitely someone willing to implement it. That bar is cleared. But is this something that there's interest in putting forward in the next proposed charter? So what I'd like to do is take a home. If people are interested in having this work done in the IETF, hum now. If you don't think it should be done here, hum now. Okay, and the second thing I'd like to do is, who would help Rich work on this? Raise your hand if you would. Okay, thank you. Okay, Phil, you're up.
Okay, so do you have the slide? So basically, this is an issue that's arisen with CAA. Some of you may know, DNS, you stick a note in there to say who can issue for a particular domain. And this has recently been voted as a requirement in the CAB forum base requirements. And, you know, as usually happens when people are forced to implement, they actually start reading the specs and reopen all the design decisions. And we ended up with a question as to whether CNAME resolution should be recursive or not. So if we go to the next slide, so here we have example.com, which is CNAME to host.example.net. Now, as the spec is currently worded, what you do is you start at www.example.com, you follow the CNAME to host.example.net, and then you follow that path up to see if you find a CAA record. If you find a CAA record at position 1, 2, 3, or 4, then you stop. Otherwise, you continue on up the original path to 5 and then 6. Now, this was the original intended, this is what the spec said, and it's actually what was intended to be said. The problem we found when we started to implement was that it's a bit of a pain to implement, number one. And the other thing is the semantics of CNAME turn out to be a little ambiguous because there are two different things you can do. And at the time we started writing CAA, the almost entirely what it was we want to map this name onto this tree, and it was a purely administrative internal thing. And now it's kind of not, because a lot of CDNs and so on are using it differently. And so this is not the intended semantics at all. So if we go to the next slide, this is what we're proposing to do instead. So you will still follow the CNAME, but you won't do any recursive tree walking. And so the proposal is that we write an errata. The CAB forum points to you must implement with the errata, and we then rev the RFC so that we have a new one. And the thing here is, if anybody desperately wants the first semantics, we need you to say fairly soon, because otherwise the CAs will all have implemented this new version and it'll be a fait accompli. So.
Eric Nygren, it's actually worse than this. You can't actually put a CAA record at number 1 because you can't have both a CNAME and another record there. So the fix that probably would be is to have a _CAA.www.example.com as something else you can look at.
This is the search path. So what you will do is that you will do a query for CAA at 1, and in doing that, you will get back a CNAME record saying, well, actually, you got to look at 2.
But there's actually worse, because it means now 2 has captured 1, and they can get into a situation where they can't actually undo it, because unless 1 goes up and puts a CAA record at 3, they have no ability to override the CAA record at 2.
They just publish. They
can't publish a record at 1, and the only way without getting rid of the CNAME.
Oh, right.
So there's kind of an ordering issue there, which might be that if wanting to move off of that to a different hosting provider, they might want to get another cert first in a different hosting provider. So probably the right thing is that we're going to make a change here. It would be worth also adding another step in where you look up _CAA.www.example.com as a step before 1. Which, if that's CNAMEd over, you could also use its target.
Okay.
This is DKG. Why would you ever want to look up at 2?
This is because in a lot of cases, we have people who have 200 domain names that all point to their corporate site. And so they just want to administer all those 200 domain names as if they're one logical entity. They're not delivering their content on a CDN or whatever. You know, if you go to Unilever, they own herpes.com, aspirin.com, and a whole load of other stuff. And it all just points to the same place. And they don't want to think about decorating anything other than their target record. They're using CNAME as its original intention, perhaps as a pure alias. Yeah, I mean,
It sounds to me like you're saying some folks have issues with their configuration management, and therefore we're making this crazy thing that nobody else actually really wants that makes it harder to do the things that you actually want to do.
Okay, we've got a queue, so John locally and then Jacob remotely.
Yeah, with the understanding that I stopped pretending to be a DNS expert in the late 80s, this is getting screwy. If these folks want to have 500 names, all of which point to the same place, let them suck it up and issue 500 certificates and 500 CAAs and go merrily on their way. And if they don't like it, maybe they should use the DNS the way it was intended, so that it becomes herpes.unilever.com rather than all of this other nonsense, or example, rather than all of this other nonsense. This is bad news. You're trying to make a patch to support a bad behavior in a way which ends up with the certificates and the semantics certificates and semantics DNS likely being different. And that's just a recipe for trouble.
Okay, Jacob.
So I think for me at least, the reason this semantics makes sense is just this is the semantics of CNAME, right? So if you look up an A record for www.example.com with your recursive resolver, it is the job of your recursive resolver to follow that CNAME, get the A record for host.example.net, and add that to its response. So it makes sense for the same pattern to be followed for CAA, right? Your recursive resolver fetches the CAA record for the end of that CNAME and gives it back to you as part of the answer. So it would actually be more of a departure from DNS norms to refuse to follow CNAMEs.
Eric Nygren, and although if you look at the current doc, the previous slide, which is actually the even more messed up case, seems to be what it currently implies, which is actually even a worse scenario to be in. But it seems like there's a bunch of cases here that want to get clarified up, both in so maybe almost that the errata list might be long enough that doing a BIS version of the document might be safer to cover some of the corner cases. Because there's also some other ones thinking about it are what happens with issue wild and CNAMEs, because that gets really weird potentially. And what happens with CNAMEs when you have a CNAME to a CNAME to a CNAME, which is another common case that the doc currently is ambiguous about.
Yeah, I mean, I did run this by DNS experts who told me to do CNAMEs because I didn't want to do CNAMEs at all. Maybe a prefix. So, as an interim fix, it seems that nobody wants this. So, pushing out an errata in the short term, saying, well, endorsing the errata that's existing and extending it, and then CAB Forum can say, do this next slide without the green ones, and we can decide what else to do instead.
Okay, so I'm going to, Russ, I'm sorry, Martin.
So I was just going to ask Phil.
Martin, who are you?
Martin Thompson. If you had two CNAME hops on the bottom there, what would your proposal be on that?
Oh, continue following the CNAME chain until it actually resolves out to
right. And so 3 and 4 goes away. Is that your suggestion?
Yeah.
And then also anything off the intermediate steps as well.
Exactly.
So you would just have 2, 5, and 6. Because
Yes.
obviously 1 would disappear.
Yeah, I mean, there can't be anything at 1 if you find a CNAME there,
Right.
obviously.
Same for D names. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the same two questions I did for Rich's proposal for new work. First is, Hum now if you think this is work that should be done in the IETF. Hum now if you don't. Okay, and raise your hand if you are willing to help write or review these documents. Okay, thank you. And the last one for the day. We're almost out of time, so that's working out about right. Sean?
So I'm presenting SHA-1 for PKICS. Note the question mark.
SHA-3.
SHA-3, sorry. Next. SHA-4. I just made that
You
up.
already have SHA-1, Sean.
Trying to get rid of it. So what do I want? Yeah. So some people posted on the list that we need a backup algorithm, and it was like SHA-3. All right. Well, I can grab the OIDs from NIST and stick it in a draft, and they got the OIDs, but they didn't have an ASM1 thing. Like, hey, great, we could do that, but like, how far do we want to go, and do we really need this? So I'm not really wed to it. So I think really we should spend the most of the time, the remaining time, really talking about like, do we need this thing or something else or what? Because basically all I did was put the things in there. The other option is just to like go to SHA-384. Like, is it materially different enough that we have to go SHA-3? We could just do SHA-384, which is already pretty much implemented everywhere, and we have a nice day.
Yeah, SHA-2 for SHA-3 sounds good.
Wait.
You're not familiar with that comment? SHA-2 for SHA-3, which was...
Oh, no, I didn't get it.
So, I mean, like, really, this is the question, right? Like, we want to have algorithm agility. The question is, do we have to, you know, do the SHA-3 stuff, or can we just do SHA-384? It's sufficiently different that we're fine in the PKIC space for this stuff. So, I mean, that's kind of the question, really, right?
Okay, so what the question that was asked was, if problems are found in the future with SHA-256, we need to have a backup ready to go. And some folks on the mail list suggested that SHA-3 was the answer, and Eric Rascola suggested that using the longer hashes in the SHA-2 family was the answer. So that being SHA-384. So I guess the question is, using the same hums, do we want to do work here to specify the SHA-3 algorithms for use with PKICS and SMIME? Hum now if you think we should. Hum now if you think we should not. Okay, my call on that was it was a little louder for yes, but there is a significant number of no's.
So, question. So you're saying SHA-384 is not currently specified? Okay, so you're just
This draft would just go.
okay. So you're saying that you're saying that the hierarchy we discussed in sector, like, is already partly implemented. You're extending it. You're not making a gap. And namely, you've got SHA-256, you've got SHA-384, and now you're adding SHA-3. It's not like you're doing SHA-3 instead of SHA-384.
That's correct.
It seems like if you want to put the effort in.
There is one other piece of, if you're doing ed 448, yeah.
Yes.
You end up having to do the shape function. So you're going to be doing SHA-3.
Sort of, yeah. You're doing the sponge function of SHA-3.
Right. So you don't get away from it entirely.
Okay. So I think we need a little more discussion on the list about this, but I still want to ask the second question. If we do get to consensus, who wants to work on the SHA-3 documents? Okay, thank you. So my belief is that we need to wrap up the EAI document before we can even send any of these proposals to the ISG for rechartering. So let's focus on getting that done quickly. That's the end of the agenda. Any other business that that ought to be brought before this esteemed working group? Great. Enjoy the bits and bytes tonight.
So we have. There's like, I know, yeah. I can't. I don't.